Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing an ignorant teenager, but the defendant began to analyze the case as if he were a seasoned lawyer. On this day, the atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was stifling, with the rows of spectators filling the balcony, whispering among themselves. The young man stood with his hands in his pockets and his chin raised just enough to show that he wasn't afraid. This young man is Jilin Dawson, 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Jilin was indeed accused of serious charges, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at Jilin made it clear that the real trial wasn't about the law, but about something else. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers lazily tapping on the polished wood of his desk. He glanced at Jilin over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting in a mix of a sarcastic smile and disdain. He asked, "Do you think you're a legal expert? This isn't debate club, boy." At that moment, a few muffled laughs spread through the courtroom. Jilin didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He spent years preparing for this, not exactly this moment. He never planned to stand there as the accused, but he imagined himself standing in that place as a lawyer. He imagined it for many years. He knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids were memorizing basketball stats, he was memorizing case law. While his friends played video games, he imagined trials in his head. He argued imaginary cases with himself. That's because his father, Dennis Dawson, worked as a legal assistant for more than 20 years, and Jilin grew up listening to the stories he brought home. He learned how the prosecutor shortcuts procedures, how the judges can be biased, and how some defense attorneys defend their cases. He absorbed everything, and by the age of 14, he could analyze a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jilin was just a black kid in trouble. Judge Grayson sighed with boredom as he opened the case file and said, "I have a golf game at 2 o'clock, so let's get this over with quickly." The audience laughed again, but this time something changed. Jilin's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. It became clear to everyone that all he cared about was just finishing the case. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood up and spoke with the confidence of someone who had given the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Jilin Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen Oleo car, which had been reported missing just a few hours before his arrest. Officers chased him across the city, where he allegedly tried to escape before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and the prosecution believes the evidence speaks for itself." It seemed incriminating for Jilin. There was a stolen car and a chase. The situation was really bad. The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes tapping on the floor. He continued saying, "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, and that Mr. Dawson is a victim of unfortunate circumstances." Then he turned, fixing his eyes on Jilin for the first time, and said, "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room increased, and Carrington continued to sift through a stack of papers, saying, "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. It was confirmed that the car was stolen, and he was arrested according to legal procedures. It might seem straightforward to me and to most of the people who were in the room. The case is clear. There's a stolen car, a chase, and an arrest. But Jilin spent many years studying trials, to the point that he saw the loopholes, but he remained silent, watching and waiting for the right moment." Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly and said, "All right, let's hear the defense's response." They said it would be now. A public prosecutor named Jack Thornton, the government. Since entering the courtroom, the lawyer stood up and moved nervously, trying to deliver the defense's petition. But when Jilin asked him to be quiet, he hesitated, but then sat down again. For the first time, Jilin spoke and calmly said, I will represent myself, Your Honor. A heavy silence fell over the room. Grayson stared at him, then said sarcastically, "You will do what?" Jilin's voice was calm and steady as he replied, "I will defend myself." Of course. After that, whispers spread through the courtroom. Jilin took his first step forward, adjusted his stance with his hands still in his pockets, then let the silence linger just long enough to make them uncomfortable, and finally spoke. He said, "Your Honor, before I begin, I would like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised his eyebrow and folded his arms in a clear challenge. The judge said, "Go ahead." Jilin took a slow step forward, then said to Carrington, "You said that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before he was arrested, right?" Carrington exhaled sharply and answered with boredom, "Yes, that's correct." Jilin asked him, "And is this testimony written in his report?" Carrington replied, "Of course it is." Jilin nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson and said, "Your Honor, I request that this testimony be dismissed as evidence." Judge Grayson asked him, "On what grounds?" Jilin removed his hands from his pockets and pointed at the prosecution table. He said firmly, "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. He may not have even been on duty then." When the chase began, Carrington was confused and said, "What are you talking about?" Jilin said, "Your Honor, if the court permits, I would like to file a motion to check Officer Ruiz's global positioning system records on that night. If his report says he saw me in the car, then that should match his location record." The whispers of the audience grew louder, and Grayson frowned and glanced at Carrington. Counselor Carrington cleared his throat and clenched his jaw, then said, "This report was submitted by a law officer, Your Honor." "Are we really going to take the word of the accused?" Jilin said calmly. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, the global positioning system data will prove it. But if he wasn't..." Jilin didn't finish his sentence, leaving the answer hanging in the air. Grayson was silent for a long moment, then turned to Carrington and asked, "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the global positioning system records of the officer in question?" Carrington finally shook his head and said, "No objection, Your Honor." After that, the courtroom fell silent, but the tension was palpable. Carrington shuffled his papers, his confidence shaken, but he made one last attempt. "Your Honor, while we wait for the global positioning system records, we are still left with the clear fact that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen car, or possibly on the accelerator with his head." He said, "Let's talk about this evidence for a moment," then turned to the jury and made eye contact with each one of them. He said, "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in the car means I stole it. This is the story they're selling, but let's think about this logically." Then he took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, controlled tone. "Let's say you walk into a department store, try on a jacket, put your hands in its pockets, or maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack. A few hours later, you leave, and someone steals that jacket. Does the presence of your fingerprints on it mean that you stole it?" Some of the jurors exchanged glances, and someone muttered something quietly, but Jilin didn't give them time to process it, and he continued saying, "The car in question was parked in front of my 11/7 store hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we passed by the car, I leaned on it and even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car, I didn't drive it, I didn't steal anything from inside it. It was just a stupid moment of curiosity that made me decide to try sitting inside it. Yes, it was a foolish act, but I didn't do anything more than just sit inside it and touch the steering wheel." He was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked them, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat as he flipped through his notes. He was looking for something, anything, to regain his control. Jilin didn't stop there, but he continued saying, "And while we're on the subject, Let's talk about how to conduct fingerprint analysis. That's it. He turned to Grayson and asked, Your Honor, have the forensic evidence specialists in this case been called to testify? Grayson blinked in surprise at the question, then glanced at Carrington to answer it. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly said no. Jilin pressed his lips together and said, So the state is using forensic evidence to try to convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the specialist who personally handled that evidence. Don't I have the right to cross-examine or to ask about the chain of custody or to challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Judge Grayson sighed, realizing that winning this case wouldn't be easy, but Jilin wasn't finished yet, because the next thing he was about to say would change everything. His voice was steady, but firm. Then he said, I would like to submit as evidence an official statement from the car owner. Judge Grayson frowned and said in surprise, The owner? Omagil nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Thomas, the owner of the stolen car, who gave a statement to the police, which for some reason was never submitted in the prosecution's files. For you, but I think I know why. Then he turned to Carrington and said, Do you remember what Mr. Thomas told the officers on the night he reported his car stolen? Did Carrington's jaw tighten? Because he knew exactly what was coming. At this point, Jilin didn't wait for his answer, but took out a printed copy of his file and read aloud what was written in Mr. Thomas's statement. I left my car running and ran into the gas station. Someone jumped in and drove off with the car, but it wasn't the man you arrested because I saw the thief and he was white. At this point, a collective gasp spread through the courtroom. Jilin held up the paper and raised his voice, saying, This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution deliberately failed to mention. Then he turned to Judge Grayson and said, They want this jury to believe that I am the defendant, even though my description doesn't even match the real thief's description. Carrington stepped forward and said, Your Honor, that's irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the car, but Jilin shook his head and interrupted, No, that's not true. I was arrested several blocks away from where the car was left. I was walking home after having a snack with my friends. I wasn't in the car, I wasn't near the car, and I wasn't running from anything. The only thing connecting me to this case is poor police work and a set of assumptions. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. The case was unfolding quickly, and everyone knew it. Jilin turned to the jury and said, The real suspect escaped that night. The officers found a black teenager in the same general area and decided that was close enough to consider him a suspect. That's what this case is really about. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and then said, Does the prosecution have anything else? Carrington was stiff, his face flushed, and he replied in a low voice, No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Jilin for a long time, then glanced at the jury, and finally leaned forward and spoke his final word. The judge said calmly, Case dismissed. There was a moment of silence, then chaos. Some in disbelief, others relieved. After that, the commotion grew as the audience stirred and journalists wrote the decision in their notebooks. Judge Grayson was still gripping his gavel, looking at Jilin with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, perhaps an admission, or maybe regret. Jilin turned to leave the courtroom, but as he was about to reach the door, the judge spoke again and said, Mr. Dawson. Jilin stopped, but did not turn around. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, You should consider going to law school. Jilin smiled. He didn't need to think about it, because he was already on his way to enrolling. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was filled with noise. Journalists crowded on the steps, their cameras flashing, and their microphones thrust forward like weapons toward Jilin. Questions rained down on him. Did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What will you do next? How does it feel to outperform a veteran prosecutor? Jilin pulled his hoodie cap over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in media appearances. It wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His father, Dennis, was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. His arms were folded, his expression frozen. He just looked at him, then finally nodded, exhaled, and said, "Son, you scared me to death." Jilin laughed lightly as he scratched the back of his head and said, "I had to take a chance, Dad." His father stared at him for another moment, then hugged him tightly, saying, "You've always been stubborn." Jilin drifted off. As he looked at the courthouse building, he thought about what he would do next time. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He would be the lawyer. Share this story with your friends, because the justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change. That might happen if they watch this video, so don't forget to share the video with your friends and hit like.